They never expected it to feel like this. For years, German soldiers had been told that falling into American hands meant humiliation, starvation, and cruelty. The propaganda machine repeated it without pause, painting the United States Army as a force of brutality, as if every American carried a personal hatred toward any man wearing a field gray uniform. Yet the moment many captured soldiers crossed the American lines, the truth shattered those expectations so completely that some later said it felt like stepping into a different world entirely. One built on contradictions they could not process in the first hours. The first surprise was the silence, not the absence of gunfire, but the absence of rage. No shouting, no kicks, no angry hands pulling them by their collars. The Americans simply told them where to stand, where to walk, and how to line up. Many Germans expected blows the second they lowered their rifles. Instead, the shock came from the lack of violence. They found themselves guarded by men who looked more curious than hateful, more tired than vengeful. In those first minutes, a few prisoners later wrote that they felt a strange mixture of fear and disbelief, as if this calm behavior had to be some kind of trick. Before we go deeper into their first impressions, let me quickly say this. If you enjoy stories that cut through myth and explore the human side of history, consider subscribing. It helps more than you think, and we are just getting started. The moment the prisoners were searched, the next shock arrived. The Americans did not take wedding rings, watches, family photos, or letters. If something was confiscated temporarily, it was tagged and recorded. One officer later recalled how a 19-year-old American private carefully handed him back a photograph of his wife. The private said he did not want the man to lose it. The officer, stunned, later wrote that this small act of respect impacted him more than any grand event in the war. He had been told that Americans were greedy and disrespectful, yet here was a kid barely out of school treating his belongings with more care than he himself expected. Food created one of the biggest contrasts. German soldiers whose rations had shrunk to almost nothing expected to be punished through starvation. Instead, the Americans offered meals that felt almost surreal to men who had spent weeks chewing on hardened black bread or watery soup. Hot coffee appeared first, then white bread, then canned meat. Many German prisoners described that moment with embarrassment, because they were afraid to eat too quickly or show how hungry they were. They did not want to appear weak in front of their captors. Yet the Americans simply handed out the food and stepped aside, as if feeding the enemy was the most normal duty in the world. For soldiers raised on the belief that the United States was decadent and chaotic, the most confusing part was the discipline. The camps were orderly, routines were clear, and rules were strict but predictable. Loudspeakers announced schedules, guards checked attendance, and medical staff examined new arrivals with professionalism that surprised even wounded officers. Some prisoners assumed that the kindness was temporary, that cruelty would arrive later, perhaps at night. But then, the next morning, looked exactly the same as the previous day. And the day after that looked no different. The machine of American military organization ran in a way that left many German soldiers whispering to each other that they had never seen anything like it. The water stations brought another shock. In some sectors, the Americans insisted that prisoners wash up, shave, and change into clean clothing if available. Not out of compassion, but because hygiene prevented outbreaks of disease. Still, after months of frontline dirt and exhaustion, this routine felt almost unreal. One German corporal later recalled how humiliating it felt to be given soap by a man he had been trained to hate, yet at the same time he felt a strange relief. He spoke of looking into a metal basin filled with warm water and seeing his own face clearly for the first time in weeks, and realizing that captivity had restored something the battlefield had taken from him. One of the most unexpected impressions came from the guards themselves. Many were young, sometimes shockingly young, and many behaved with an ease that contradicted the image of ruthless American killers. There were jokes among themselves, friendly arguments, and the casual posture of men who knew they had the upper hand and did not need to prove it through force. For Germans used to rigid hierarchy and constant emotional tension, this relaxed confidence was disorienting. Some mistook it for weakness, but others understood immediately that it was exactly the opposite. At night, the prisoners heard something they had not heard in a long time. Laughter. It came from the American side of the wire. Men playing cards, telling stories, talking about home, arguing about baseball, or teasing each other about small mistakes made earlier that day. German prisoners wrote that the sound made them uneasy at first, because it reminded them how different the morale was. On the German side, months of fear, shortages, and propaganda had drained almost all humor from daily life. Hearing Americans laugh freely reminded some prisoners of the world that existed before the war, a world they no longer felt part of. Even the medical treatment created emotional conflict. Severely wounded prisoners were taken to American field hospitals where they received the same procedures as American soldiers. Doctors and nurses sometimes spoke gently, sometimes hurriedly, but rarely with hostility. Morphine was given regardless of nationality. One prisoner later described lying on a stretcher next to an American wounded soldier, both of them being carried by the same medics, and realizing that the doctor did not care who was who. That moment stayed with him for decades. Yet for all the positive impressions, there was fear. Deep, suffocating fear. German soldiers did not know what future awaited them. Some believed they would be shipped overseas. Others feared retribution from local civilians, and many worried about their families back home. The contrast between gentle treatment and total uncertainty created a strange emotional tension. They were safe, yet they had never felt more powerless. They were alive, yet they had no clue what tomorrow would bring. This mixture of fear and relief defined the first hours of captivity for thousands of German prisoners. They walked into the American lines expecting brutality, and walked out confused by decency. What shocked them most was not comfort or food, but the realization that almost everything they had been told about the enemy was constructed to keep them fighting. Now that the illusion had collapsed, they were forced to confront a world that was much larger, more complicated, and more human than the narrow vision they had been raised on. And this was only the beginning. In the next part, we will explore how their impressions changed once they reached the large, organized prisoner of war camps, where the contrast with propaganda became even more dramatic. Before we continue, consider subscribing if you want to follow this entire series. It helps bring these powerful human stories to more viewers. The real shock for many German prisoners did not come during the moment of surrender, but in the days that followed, when they were transported to the larger and better organized American prisoner of war camps. These camps, spread across Europe and later across the United States, confronted them with a reality so far removed from the propaganda they had consumed that some soldiers struggled to understand whether it was genuine or part of some elaborate deception. The journey from the front lines to the camps offered a strange mixture of exhaustion, anxiety, and unexpected comfort that would stay with them for years. The first stage of that journey was usually the march to a collection point. Many prisoners expected to be paraded through hostile towns or humiliated in front of civilians. What they experienced instead was far less dramatic. American guards simply walked them along the road, sometimes in complete silence, sometimes exchanging casual remarks among themselves. The guards rarely spoke to the prisoners directly, unless it was necessary, which created an odd psychological space. The lack of hostility made the Germans unsure how to behave. Should they show discipline, or would that be viewed as arrogance? Should they appear humble, or would that be interpreted as weakness? Many later wrote that these early marches felt like walking through a dream where nothing behaved the way they were told it would. When they finally reached the larger transport hubs, the scale of American logistics became impossible to ignore. Trucks arrived in timed waves, supplies were moved quickly, guards rotated in shifts, and everything followed a schedule that seemed almost industrial in its precision. For soldiers who had watched their own supply lines collapse under Allied air power, seeing such order felt both intimidating and strangely comforting. They were entering a system that treated prisoners not as trophies, but as part of an organized wartime process. That simple fact already contradicted years of propaganda. Arrival at a permanent camp was often the moment when many German prisoners realized that their expectations were not merely incorrect, but completely disconnected from reality. The camps had fences, guard towers, and clear rules, but they also had kitchens, medical stations, laundry areas, and recreation fields. Some prisoners described a strange emotional confusion when they first saw these facilities. They were not luxurious by any measure, and American military rations were nowhere near the abundance found in Hollywood depictions. Yet, to men who had been half-starved at the front, the idea that a camp built for the enemy included regular meals, showers, and even access to medical care felt almost unbelievable. The routines inside the camps were strict but predictable. Prisoners were counted in the morning and the evening, assigned to barracks, and briefed on the rules. What struck many Germans was the tone of the American officers. They spoke firmly, but without the harshness expected from victorious captors. One prisoner recalled an American lieutenant who addressed them with a calm, almost bureaucratic tone, explaining that discipline was necessary for everyone's safety, including theirs. The lieutenant concluded by saying that as long as the rules were followed, there would be no problems. This simple, almost indifferent professionalism felt entirely at odds with the image of Americans as vengeful and undisciplined barbarians. Food remained one of the most consistently surprising aspects. The rations were not always generous, especially as the war dragged on, but they were consistent, and consistency alone felt like a luxury. Some German officers admitted privately that their own troops at the front often ate worse than the men in American captivity. This realization created a quiet, uncomfortable internal conflict. How could the enemy, portrayed as chaotic and corrupt, provide better nourishment to prisoners than the Reich could provide to its own soldiers? Medical care amplified that conflict even further. In many camps, newly arrived prisoners were given physical examinations intended to identify infections, wounds, or diseases that needed treatment. For men who had marched through snow and mud with untreated frostbite or infected cuts, the idea of receiving medical attention from the enemy felt almost surreal. One prisoner recalled sitting in a line outside the infirmary, watching an American medic wrap clean bandages on the leg of a man who had been screaming in pain for days. The medic spoke quietly, telling him to drink water and get rest. To the prisoner watching, this moment shattered any remaining belief that Americans were crude or indifferent. The emotional shock was not limited to kindness. There were also profound feelings of shame. Some prisoners wrote later that receiving humane treatment from the enemy forced them to question the world they had been raised in. They wondered what else had been hidden from them, what truths had been twisted to keep them fighting, and what the future of their country could possibly look like if so much of their worldview had already collapsed. These thoughts did not form instantly, nor did they erase years of indoctrination, but they began quietly, usually at night, when the camp grew still and the sounds of guards walking past the fences echoed through the darkness. Work assignments added another layer of unexpected experience. Many camps allowed or encouraged prisoners to take on labor tasks, not as punishment, but as part of wartime necessity. These tasks ranged from kitchen duty to unloading supplies or maintaining camp facilities. The American guards often supervised with little emotion, neither praising nor mocking the prisoners. For Germans used to rigid ranks and constant tension, the casual, almost cooperative atmosphere felt strange. One prisoner later wrote that the Americans seemed far less concerned with social status and far more focused on getting the job done, no matter who participated. This egalitarian attitude was confusing at first, but over time it left a deep impression. Perhaps the most emotionally complex moment for many prisoners came when they realized that the Americans expected them to entertain themselves. Camps often had sports areas, books, or materials for crafts and music. At first, many soldiers avoided these activities out of pride or fear of being viewed as weak. But slowly, as days turned into weeks, the human need for distraction took hold. Some began playing soccer, others joined small orchestras, and some simply sat and talked, trying to piece together the fragments of their beliefs that no longer made sense. For many, these quiet conversations became an unexpected form of therapy, a space where they could finally speak about fears they had never dared admit before. Letters played a crucial role in shaping impressions. When mail finally reached the camps, prisoners discovered that their families back home were still alive, still writing, and still hoping for them to return. The Americans delivered these letters with regularity, and that simple act of connection to home created an emotional bridge that eased the psychological burden of captivity. Some prisoners later said that the moment they received their first letter was the moment they understood they would survive the war. Yet, beneath all the surprise and relief, there was still a persistent layer of anxiety. Many prisoners feared what would happen when the war ended. Some wondered if they would be tried as criminals. Others worried about retaliation from their own government if they ever returned home. The camps provided safety, but they could not erase the uncertainty that lingered in every conversation. The contrast between propaganda and reality created a strange emotional duality. They admired the efficiency and fairness of their captors, yet they feared the consequences of acknowledging that admiration too openly. In the end, the camps became a place where thousands of German soldiers experienced a kind of emotional awakening. They encountered a reality that contradicted everything they had been taught about the enemy. They learned that Americans were not monsters, but men with their own flaws, hopes, and routines. And they realized that the world beyond the borders of the Reich was far larger, more complex, and more humane than they had ever imagined. This adjustment did not happen quickly. It unfolded slowly, through daily routines, quiet moments, and the simple recognition that the narrative they had believed in was collapsing piece by piece. For many, the camp became the first place where they truly questioned the world they had served, and the first environment where they saw the possibility of a different life. Inside the camps, daily life slowly became predictable, but predictability did not erase the emotional shock that German prisoners felt as they confronted a world that contradicted almost everything they believed. These moments did not arrive all at once. They came quietly, sometimes during a conversation, sometimes in the middle of a routine task, sometimes in a single gesture that broke through years of indoctrination like a crack of light in a dark room. And it was often these small human details that left the deepest, most lasting impressions. One of the earliest and most powerful shocks came from the way Americans interacted with each other. German soldiers, raised in a society defined by rigid hierarchy and constant pressure to obey, expected to see strict divisions between officers and enlisted men. Instead, they noticed something completely foreign to them. American privates joked with sergeants, sergeants teased lieutenants, and officers often spoke to their men with a relaxed tone that bordered on casual conversation. A German prisoner later wrote that it was the first time he understood how different Western democracy truly was. If a German private had spoken to a senior officer the way American soldiers did, he said, the consequences would have been immediate and harsh. To witness such informality without punishment felt almost unreal. Another unexpected moment came from the camp's library system. Many American prisoner-of-war camps stocked shelves with books donated by local communities, soldiers, or relief organizations. When the Germans were first told they could borrow books, many assumed they had misunderstood the translation. The idea that the enemy would provide literature to captured soldiers seemed absurd. Yet within days, men who had been fighting in France or the Ardennes were reading American novels, English poetry, and even translations of German classics. One prisoner recalled how strange it felt to sit in a wooden barrack with a copy of an American history book in his hands, while a guard nearby smoked a cigarette and said nothing. The simple freedom to choose what to read, something the war had stripped from them, began to undermine the image of Americans as uncultured or intellectually inferior. Sports created another surprising impression. The Americans encouraged athletic activities not only for recreation, but also as a way to reduce tension in the camps. Prisoners were given soccer balls, and in some camps, makeshift fields were set up. The guards sometimes watched the games with amusement, and in rare cases, even joined informally. For the Germans, who had expected hostility and punishment, the sight of American guards cheering or laughing at a good play felt like stepping into a completely different reality. The shared language of sports briefly erased the lines between captor and captive, creating moments of humanity in a place defined by war. Music played a powerful role in reshaping perceptions. Many camps allowed prisoners to form orchestras or small bands using instruments collected from local sources or brought from home before surrender. One evening, in a camp in the Midwest, German musicians performed a classical piece during a sunset assembly. When they finished, the Americans watching applauded. Some prisoners were deeply moved by the respect shown to their music, especially because their propaganda had insisted that Americans were culturally empty and uninterested in refined art. The applause, simple as it was, forced many prisoners to re-examine their assumptions about the people guarding them. The most profound shock often came from the treatment of wounded or sick prisoners. Some German soldiers expected that any man unable to work would be ignored or left to deteriorate. Instead, camp infirmaries treated them with the same procedures used for American troops. One prisoner later described how he was given medicine for pneumonia and placed in a heated room to recover. He wrote in his diary that he had expected to die, and instead he found himself being cared for by men who had every reason to despise him. This care did not erase his guilt or fear, but it changed his understanding of the enemy in a way no political speech ever could. The fairness of the disciplinary system also surprised many prisoners. Punishments existed, of course, but they were regulated, documented, and rarely physical. Infractions such as fighting, refusing orders, or attempting escape resulted in temporary confinement rather than severe beatings or torture. German prisoners often compared this to their own military culture, where punishment could be brutal and immediate. One soldier later wrote that the Americans seemed more interested in order than vengeance, and that realization forced many prisoners to reconsider everything they had been taught about American brutality. Another deeply emotional moment for many prisoners came during interactions with the American guards, who were of German descent. Across the United States, millions of families had German roots, and some American soldiers spoke fluent or near-fluent German. When these guards talked with prisoners, they often did so with a tone that mixed familiarity, disappointment, and, in some cases, quiet sympathy. For prisoners who expected to be treated like monsters, being addressed by a guard who shared their last name or spoke with a recognizably German accent created a moment of intense disorientation. These interactions reminded them that the divisions between nations, so brutally enforced by war, were often thinner than they had believed. Perhaps the most unexpected shock came from the moments when American guards expressed curiosity rather than hostility. They asked about life in Germany, about training, about families, and about the experiences of fighting in Europe. These conversations were not interrogations. They were casual exchanges between young men trying to make sense of a conflict bigger than any of them. A German prisoner later wrote that the first time a guard asked him whether he missed home, he almost did not know how to respond. He had prepared himself for cruelty, not empathy. The arrival of the Red Cross brought yet another layer of surprise. Representatives checked the camps, inspected food quality, verified mail procedures, and ensured that prisoners had access to medical supplies. The transparency shocked many Germans, who had been told that the Americans ignored international law. One prisoner described watching a Red Cross official walk freely through the camp, taking notes and speaking with prisoners directly. He said that in that moment, he realized he was living in a system that valued accountability, something he had rarely experienced under the Reich. But the most emotionally overwhelming shock, the one that appeared again and again in memoirs, was the moment prisoners realized that their captors did not hate them. They expected anger, and instead they encountered indifference or, in rare cases, compassion. This did not mean that the Americans forgot the devastation of war or forgave the regime responsible for it. It simply meant that the guards saw them as soldiers, not as symbols. That distinction made an enormous psychological difference. Some prisoners even wrote about feeling guilty because the Americans treated them better than their own leadership had in the final months of the war. They struggled to reconcile the reality of life in captivity with the loyalty they still felt toward their homeland. For many, this internal struggle marked the beginning of a long emotional transformation, one that would continue long after the war ended. The greatest contrast with propaganda was not comfort or food or medical care. It was the realization that the Americans behaved according to rules and values that did not match the monstrous image painted by the Reich. This discovery forced many prisoners to reevaluate not only their understanding of the enemy, but also their understanding of themselves. For the first time, they were seeing the outside world clearly, without the filter of ideology, and the experience was overwhelming. In the next part, we will explore how these impressions evolved after the war ended, when the fate of millions of prisoners hung in the balance, and how captivity in America shaped their beliefs and lives for decades to come. When the war finally ended, the atmosphere inside the American prisoner of war camps shifted in ways that were subtle at first and then overwhelming. The gunfire across Europe quieted, the front lines dissolved into borders and occupation zones, and entire nations began the long and painful process of rebuilding. For the German prisoners still held in American custody, the end of the war did not bring immediate freedom. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new chapter filled with questions, uncertainty, hope, and a strange sense of transformation that many could not fully explain at the time. The first shock after the German surrender was the sudden silence in the camps. The guards no longer listened for distant artillery or planes. The tension of combat, which had lingered in the background like a constant low hum, disappeared almost overnight. Some prisoners described this silence as peaceful, while others found it unsettling. They had spent years in a world defined by danger, fear, and noise. Now, the quiet forced them to confront thoughts they had avoided during the war, including their own role in a conflict that had consumed their homeland. As news of Germany's collapse spread, many prisoners felt a deep and painful mixture of grief and relief. They worried for their families, their towns, and their future. Yet they also understood on some instinctive level that the nightmare of endless fighting had finally stopped. Letters arriving from home painted a picture of devastation. Cities reduced to rubble, food growing scarce, families displaced, parents struggling to survive. It was during this period that many prisoners began to feel the full emotional weight of the war in a way they had never felt while fighting it. Inside the camps, the Americans maintained routine and order, but a new tone entered their administration. The guards no longer treated the prisoners as potential threats, and instead approached them like men waiting for a massive bureaucratic process to resolve. Work assignments continued, but the pressure lifted. Rules remained, but the emotional walls on both sides began to crack. Prisoners and guards talked more openly, exchanging stories, discussing life, asking careful but honest questions about what came next. For many German prisoners, this was the moment when they fully realized that the enemy they had been taught to fear was not the enemy they had met. One prisoner later wrote that he did not understand the meaning of the word humanity until he experienced defeat. He described an American guard who told him, in simple words, that the war was over now and that someday they would all return home. The guard said it with a calm confidence that made the prisoner believe it for the first time. This small moment stayed with him for the rest of his life. As months passed and repatriation lists were prepared, new emotions took hold inside the camps. Many men felt eager to return home, but also afraid of what they would find when they arrived. Their captivity, which had once felt terrifying, now seemed like a strange sanctuary between two broken worlds. They knew what awaited them in Germany: destruction, hunger, and the weight of a future filled with uncertainty. But what they did not know was how their country would treat them. Would returning prisoners be viewed as failures, as traitors, or as witnesses to truths their homeland did not want to hear? The Americans, meanwhile, focused on adhering to the process established by international law. Medical checks were performed. Identity documents were updated. The Red Cross facilitated communication. Some prisoners were assigned temporary labor tasks that contributed to the American agricultural and industrial effort, especially in regions that faced labor shortages. Many of these prisoners later said that this period shaped their view of American society even more deeply than the war itself. They met farmers, factory owners, and ordinary workers who treated them with a level of fairness and respect they had not expected. These interactions broke through the last remnants of propaganda that still lingered in their minds. One of the most profound experiences for many prisoners was discovering the openness of American society. Camp newspapers, often written by prisoners themselves, included articles about democracy, music, literature, and life in the United States. Educational programs were introduced in some camps, offering lessons in English, mathematics, economics, or history. This exposure played a significant role in reshaping the worldview of many young prisoners. Some later wrote that they learned more about freedom in captivity than they ever had in school back home. There were also painful moments. Not all prisoners adjusted easily to life in the camps, and not all guards were patient or compassionate. Some prisoners struggled with guilt, others with anger, and others with the fear that their families had not survived. But even during the hardest periods, many German prisoners found themselves comparing their treatment with what they had been told to expect. Again and again, they found contradictions that forced them to reevaluate the world they had grown up in. As repatriation finally began, and prisoners boarded ships and trains to return to Europe, the emotional weight of the experience reached its peak. Many looked back at the camps with mixed feelings. They had arrived in fear, learned to live in routine, and were leaving with a new understanding of the world. Some prisoners wept openly as they shook hands with American guards they had come to respect. Others remained stoic, holding their feelings inside, but almost all of them carried memories that would shape the rest of their lives. When they returned to Germany, the contrast was overwhelming. Towns were destroyed. Families were scattered. Food was scarce. The world they had left behind no longer existed. Some prisoners felt guilty for having lived in relative safety while their homeland suffered. Others felt a sense of quiet gratitude. knowing that captivity had given them time to survive and reflect. And many felt a deep internal conflict, torn between loyalty to the country they loved and the realization that much of what they had believed was based on lies. It was often years later, sometimes decades, that these men finally spoke openly about their captivity. They wrote memoirs, gave interviews, and shared memories with their families. Again and again, the same themes emerged: respect, fairness, discipline, humanity. The shock of discovering that the enemy had treated them with dignity. The realization that the world outside their borders was far less cruel than they had been taught to believe. These experiences shaped an entire generation of German veterans. Many returned home with a changed understanding of freedom, democracy, and human nature. Some became advocates for reconciliation. Others dedicated themselves to rebuilding Germany in a more just and open way. And many simply carried their memories quietly, allowing their stories to speak through the lives they built. In the end, the first impressions that German prisoners had of American captivity became some of the most powerful lessons of the war. Not because the camps were perfect, and not because every guard was kind, but because the truth of their experience exposed the enormous gap between propaganda and reality. It showed that even in war, humanity can survive. And it revealed that sometimes the most transformative moments come not from ideology or victory, but from simple acts of fairness, in the face of unimaginable destruction. If you want to see more stories that cut through myth and reveal the human side of history, consider subscribing. It takes only a moment and helps bring forgotten voices and real experiences to a wider audience.